There is a mountain at the northern edge of the ancient Greek world that the people who lived in its shadow believed touched the very ceiling of existence, not because it was the tallest, not because its slopes were the most treacherous, but because they believed, with absolute and unquestioning certainty, that something lived at its peak, something that watched, something that judged, something that, if it chose to, could end you with the sound of a thought made physical. His name was Zeus, and for nearly 3,000 years he was the most powerful being that the human imagination had ever conceived. To understand Zeus is not merely to understand a story. It is to understand the way an entire civilization looked up at a sky full of clouds and lightning and chose to see not chaos, but a king, a personality, a will. It is to understand that the ancient Greeks did not simply invent their gods the way a child invents a game. They needed them. They needed a face for the thunder. They needed a name for the thing that decided whether the harvest came or didn't, whether the ship made it home, whether the battle was won. And the face they chose, again and again, across centuries, across city-states, across the full sweep of an astonishing civilization, was his. Zeus, Lord of the sky, ruler of Olympus, father of gods and men. His domain was the heavens themselves, the open sky in all its moods, the thunder that rolled across it, and the lightning bolt he carried not as a weapon of last resort, but as a natural extension of his hand. Where a king carries a scepter, Zeus carried the storm. He governed the weather, the seasons, the turning of celestial order. He presided over justice, over law, over the sacred bonds of hospitality that the Greeks called xenia, one of their most deeply held moral beliefs, that the stranger at your door deserves your protection, because Zeus himself may be watching, may, in fact, be that stranger. That was the scale of him, not merely the god of big weather, but the guarantor of civilization's most fundamental contracts, and he was strong in a way that ancient language almost struggles to contain. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Homer, who gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey, described Zeus as the one whose nod alone could shake Olympus, not his fist, not his lightning. His nod. The gods themselves, his own siblings, his own children, moved carefully around him. Even Hera, his wife, who could be formidable and cunning in her own right, spent much of the mythology working around Zeus rather than against him, because against him was a place very few beings dared to stand twice. His birth was not peaceful. Nothing about the world he was born into was. His father was Cronus, a titan, one of the ancient pre-Olympian deities who ruled existence before the gods of Olympus existed at all, and Cronus, who had overthrown his own father Uranus to claim dominion over the cosmos, had been given a prophecy that haunted him, that one of his children would, in turn, overthrow him. His solution was grimly efficient. As each child was born, he swallowed them. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, all consumed by their own father, imprisoned within him, alive but powerless. When Zeus was born, his mother Rhea had finally had enough. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and offered it to Cronus, who swallowed it without question, and the infant Zeus was spirited away to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, where he was raised by nymphs, fed on honey and the milk of a sacred goat named Amalthea, hidden from the world until he was strong enough to change it. When that moment came, he changed it completely. Zeus returned, forced Cronus to regurgitate his siblings, and then led them in a 10-year war against the Titans, the Titanomachy, a conflict so vast and violent that the ancient sources described it shaking the very foundations of the earth. The Titans were defeated. Cronus was overthrown, And from the rubble of that ancient order, 3 brothers drew lots for the divided world. Poseidon took the seas, Hades took the underworld, and Zeus took the sky, which meant, in the logic of the ancient Greeks, that he took everything above it. What followed was a mythology of extraordinary richness, stories of love and betrayal, of justice and vengeance, of gods who behaved with very human flaws, and a mortal world that suffered and thrived by turns because of it. Zeus fathered heroes. He toppled tyrants. He disguised himself and walked among men. He punished those who overreached, and occasionally, in his more compassionate moments, he protected those who had nowhere else to turn. He was, in the truest sense, the axis around which an entire world rotated, and we are only just beginning. Before we speak of what Zeus did, we must first understand what Zeus was, because the ancient Greeks were precise people in their way. They were philosophers before they had a word for philosophy. They were scientists before they had a method for science, and when they built their gods, they did not build them carelessly. Each deity occupied a specific territory of existence, a domain that was theirs to govern, to embody, to personify. Aphrodite was not merely a beautiful woman who liked love. She was love in its most destabilizing and irresistible form. Ares was not merely a soldier. He was the pure, impersonal violence of war itself, the part of battle that has nothing to do with honor and everything to do with blood. Zeus was not merely a powerful ruler who happened to control the weather. He was order itself, wearing the shape of a king. Let us begin with the sky, because that is where he lived, and the sky in the ancient world was not an empty backdrop. It was the most consequential thing a person looked at every single day. Whether the sky was clear or violent determined whether crops grew, whether ships sailed, whether armies marched. The sky was fate, delivered in real time. And Zeus owned all of it. The Greeks called him Ombrios, the god of rain. They called him Astropios, the one who hurls lightning. They called him Nephilegorita, the cloud gatherer, a title Homer used so frequently it became almost a second name. When you read the Iliad and encounter that phrase again and again, the cloud gatherer, you begin to feel the weight of it, a being so associated with the movement of the atmosphere that the sky's own moods were understood as his thinking, made visible. His weapons were the thunderbolts, and these deserve a moment of attention all their own. The thunderbolts of Zeus were not simply lightning the way we understand lightning, a discharge of static electricity between clouds and earth. In the Greek imagination they were forged, crafted deliberately. The Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who lived beneath the earth and worked in fire, created them for Zeus after he freed them from imprisonment during the Titanomachy. They were gifts of gratitude, and they were extraordinary, bolts of pure divine force, capable of destroying nearly anything they touched. When Zeus was angry, truly angry, the thunderbolt was how that anger arrived in the world, not a metaphor. A physical, devastating fact. Mountains split. Ships sank mid-ocean. Men who had offended the divine order were reduced to ash before they could draw another breath. And yet, and this is something worth sitting with, Zeus did not use them constantly. That restraint was part of his power. A king who executes everyone who displeases him is not powerful. He is afraid. Zeus held the thunderbolt the way a good judge holds a sentence, aware of its weight, selective in its application, and all the more terrifying for not having used it yet. Beyond the sky is domain extended into territory that is harder to see but equally important. Zeus was the god of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. This was, to the ancient Greeks, not a matter of politeness. It was a moral architecture, the obligation to welcome the stranger, to feed them, to shelter them, to send them on their way with gifts. This was considered divinely mandated and Zeus was its enforcer. He was called Zeus Xenios in this capacity. Zeus, the protector of guests. To violate Xenia was not merely rude, it was a direct offense against the king of the gods, and the mythology is full of examples of what happened to those who committed it. The entire Trojan War, in one reading, is a story about what happens when a guest, Paris of Troy, violates the hospitality of his host, Menelaus of Sparta, by stealing his wife. The consequences reverberated for a decade and swallowed 2 civilizations. He was also Zeus Horkios, the keeper of oaths. Oaths sworn in his name carried the full weight of divine law. To break such an oath was to invite his wrath personally. In a world without contracts, without courts, without notarized documents, the oath sworn before Zeus was the most binding legal instrument that existed. It was the foundation on which treaties were built, on which alliances were made, on which the basic machinery of civilization was allowed to function. He did not merely rule from above. He was embedded in the very fabric of how humans organized their lives together. And then there was his role as Zeus Soter, Zeus the savior, the protector. Cities prayed to him for deliverance. Sailors called on him in storms. Armies made offerings to him before battle. He was the final court of appeal for a world that had nowhere else to turn. Now, his symbols, the eagle, the oak tree, the thunderbolt, the scepter. Each of these was not chosen arbitrarily. The eagle was the king of birds, powerful, far-seeing, capable of soaring at heights no other creature could reach. It was the natural ambassador of the sky, and it became Zeus's sacred animal, his messenger and his emblem, when an eagle appeared at a significant moment in Greek life. Before a battle, before a decision, during a ceremony, it was read as a sign. Zeus was watching. Zeus was present. Zeus was, perhaps, weighing in. The oak tree carried a different kind of meaning. At Dodona, in the northwest of Greece, there was an oracle, one of the oldest in the Greek world, older even than Delphi, where the will of Zeus was read in the rustling of the leaves of a great sacred oak, not through the ecstatic visions of a priestess as at Delphi, but through something quieter, the wind moving through ancient branches. Suppliants would come with their questions, and the priests and priestesses, called the Seloi, who slept on the ground with unwashed feet, staying close to the earth, would interpret the sound of the tree. There is something in that image that feels very old. Not the Zeus of the thunderbolt in the palace on Olympus, but an earlier Zeus, a deity of earth and sky and the deep organic forces of the natural world, before civilization had fully shaped him into a king. The scepter, of course, was the symbol of kingship itself. Zeus held it as the ruler of both gods and men, and when he extended it to others, as he sometimes did, lending authority to heroes or kings, it was the most literal possible expression of divine endorsement. His physical form, as the Greeks conceived and depicted it, was not subtle. He was imagined as a mature man, not young, not old, but fully arrived, broad-shouldered, bearded, with the thick, full beard of established authority. The Greeks did not picture their king of the gods as a beautiful youth, the way they might picture Apollo. Apollo was radiance and perfection, and the future. Zeus was something different, settled power, accumulated force, the look of a being who has already fought the war that needed to be fought, already established the order that needed to be established, and is now simply governing, with an ease that comes from knowing, with complete certainty, that nothing in the cosmos can unseat him. His home was Olympus, and it is worth being clear about what Olympus actually was in Greek cosmology. It was not simply the physical mountain, though the Greeks associated it with the tallest peak in their world. It was a realm above the clouds, a divine territory that existed at a remove from human experience, where the gods lived in palaces, feasted on ambrosia and nectar, and conducted the business of running the universe. Zeus's palace sat at the highest point of all of it. He held court there. He received the other gods there. He presided over disputes, issued judgments, and occasionally, when the mood took him, descended from that height to involve himself directly in the world below. That descent was always consequential. When Zeus moved through the mortal world, things changed. Dynasties were founded. Heroes were conceived. Punishments were delivered. The mythology is full of these moments. The god of all things choosing, for reasons that often seem personal and immediate, to step into human affairs and make his presence undeniable. He was not a distant, abstract deity who had wound up the universe and stepped back to watch it run. He was engaged, sometimes capriciously, sometimes magnificently, sometimes in ways that left suffering in his wake, and sometimes in ways that preserved justice when nothing else could. He was, in all of this, a complicated figure, which is precisely what made him so enduring. A simple, perfectly good God who never erred is a comfortable idea. But the Greeks did not build comfortable ideas. They built true ones, and the truth they understood, the truth Zeus embodied, was that power is never simple, that even the greatest force in existence makes choices that cannot always be defended, carries appetites that cannot always be controlled, and governs a world that resists, at every turn, the clean application of order. Zeus was all of that, the lightning and the law, the eagle and the oak, the king who could shake Olympus with a nod, and who still, somehow, found himself tangled in the very human business of love, pride, rage, and consequence. We have only described him. We have not yet told you what he did. Every kingdom has an origin story, and the kingdom of Zeus, the ordered cosmos that the Greeks believed they inhabited, the world of seasons and justice and divine law, did not arrive gently. It was not handed down through peaceful succession or established by quiet agreement among ancient powers. It was fought for, inch by inch, age by age, through two of the most cataclysmic conflicts that Greek mythology ever conceived. To understand Zeus fully, you must understand what he survived, what he won, because the authority he carries throughout the mythology, that settled, immovable quality we spoke of in the last segment, is not simply the confidence of the powerful. It is the particular confidence of someone who has stood at the edge of absolute destruction, looked into it without blinking, and come back holding the keys to everything. Let us go back to the beginning, or as close to the beginning as the Greek imagination could reach. Before Zeus, before the Olympians, before even the Titans, there was chaos. Not chaos in the way we use the word today, meaning disorder or confusion, but chaos as the Greeks meant it, the primordial void, the yawning darkness before anything had shape or name or boundary. From chaos emerged the first great forces of existence: Gaia, the earth; Oranos, the sky; and from their union came the Titans, 12 vast ancient beings of enormous power, the first generation of gods to truly rule the cosmos. Their king was Cronus, and Cronus, as we have already touched upon, was not a benevolent ruler. He had overthrown his own father Oranos, castrating him, separating earth and sky, seizing power with deliberate violence, and then governed the cosmos with the particular anxiety of someone who knows exactly what he did to get where he is. The prophecy told to him was almost a mirror: as you have done, so it will be done to you. One of your children will take what you have taken. And so he swallowed them. There is something in that image, the king devouring his own children to preserve his reign, that the ancient Greeks understood as a kind of moral verdict. Power that feeds on the future to protect itself is power already in decline. It does not know this yet, but the story does. When Zeus was born and hidden, and when he grew to full strength in that cave on Crete, he returned to the world his father ruled with a clear and simple purpose. Not revenge exactly, though there was certainly that element. More precisely, correction. The cosmos was under the governance of a being who had forfeited the right to govern it, and Zeus intended to change that. He obtained a powerful emetic, in some versions of the story, prepared by the Titaness Metis, who would later become his first great consort, and administered it to Cronus in disguise. What followed was perhaps the most consequential act of divine indigestion in all of mythology. Cronus vomited up his children in reverse order of swallowing. First the stone that had been substituted for Zeus, then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia. They emerged fully grown, fully divine, and, understandably, fully committed to the cause of overthrowing their father. The war that followed lasted 10 years. 10 years, in a mythological conflict, is not simply a duration, it is a statement about the scale of resistance. The Titans were not a minor obstacle. They were the previous order of the cosmos, ancient, powerful, deeply entrenched. They held Othrys, their great mountain fortress. The Olympians held Olympus, and between those two peaks, the universe shook. The turning point came when Zeus made a decision that demonstrated something crucial about his character. He recognized that winning required alliances he could not manufacture through force alone. Deep within the earth, imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest abyss of the underworld, were beings that Cronus had lopped away. The Cyclopes, those one-eyed master craftsmen, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, creatures of such grotesque and overwhelming power that even the Titans had feared them enough to keep them imprisoned rather than risk their rebellion. Zeus went to Tartarus and freed them, all of them. He fed them nectar and ambrosia, restoring their strength, and asked for their allegiance. The Cyclopes gave him the thunderbolts, those forged weapons of divine lightning we have already spoken of. They gave Poseidon his trident. They gave Hades a helmet of invisibility. The Hecatoncheires gave something simpler and more devastating themselves. Each one possessed 100 hands, and in each hand they could hurl a boulder. When they entered the battle, they rained 300 rocks simultaneously upon the Titans, a barrage so overwhelming that the ancient sources described the earth groaning, the sea boiling, the very ground of Tartarus trembling in sympathy with the violence above it. The Titans broke. Cronus and his allies were defeated, bound, and cast into Tartarus, the prison they had once used for others, now their eternal home, sealed with bronze walls and guarded by the Hecatoncheires themselves. The old order was over. The new one began. Zeus and his brothers divided the cosmos. The lots were drawn. The sky passed to Zeus, the sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades. The earth and Olympus were held in common, and for a moment, a cosmological breath. It might have seemed that the hard work was finished. It was not finished, because the earth herself, Gaia, was not satisfied with the outcome. She had, in earlier times, supported Zeus against Cronus, helping to conceal the infant god, aiding in the early stages of his rebellion. But the imprisonment of the Titans troubled her. They were her children too, in the deepest sense, and so, in her grief and her anger, she brought forth a new generation of challengers, the giants, enormous beings of terrible power, born from the blood of the wounded Oranos where it had fallen upon the earth. She urged them to rise against the Olympians, and rise they did. The Gigantomachy, the war against the giants, was a different kind of conflict than the Titanomachy. The Titans had been divine in the full sense, gods of the old order with their own authority and legitimacy. The giants were something rawer, more physical, more relentless. Some ancient sources described them with serpents for legs. rooted in the earth from which they had sprung, which give you a sense of their nature, not beings of the sky and mind, but beings of the earth's deep violence, chthonic and unstoppable. A prophecy complicated matters considerably. The giants could not be defeated by the gods alone. A mortal hero had to fight alongside them for the Olympians to prevail. Zeus's solution to this problem was characteristically direct. He fathered one, Heracles, the greatest hero of the Greek world, the strongest man who ever lived, was the son of Zeus and the mortal woman, Alcmene. He was, in many ways, purpose-built for exactly this crisis. And when the gigantomachy erupted, Heracles fought alongside the gods, his mortal arrows providing the killing blows that divine weapons alone could not deliver. Giant by giant, the battle was resolved. Enceladus was buried under the island of Sicily, and the Greeks believed that his restless turning beneath the earth was what caused volcanic eruptions from Mount Etna. Porphyrion, the king of the giants, was struck by both Zeus's lightning and Heracles' arrows simultaneously. Polybotes was chased across the sea by Poseidon, who broke off a piece of the island of Kos and buried him beneath it. The violence was total, and the victories were hard won. But they were victories. The Olympians held, and with that second great war concluded, the cosmos finally settled into something resembling the order that the ancient Greeks recognized as their world. The Titans below, the giants defeated, the Olympians above, Zeus presiding over all of it from the height of his mountain palace, with a clarity of authority that had now been tested not once but twice against the most powerful forces that the earth and the ancient world could raise against him. There is a reason that these wars are placed at the foundation of Greek mythology. They are not decorative. They are explanatory. They answer a question that any serious theological imagination must eventually ask. If the present order is good and the present ruler is just, then why was there ever anything before them? Why did it have to be fought for at all? The Greek answer is as honest as it is unsettling, because order is not the natural state of things. Chaos came first. Violence came first. The world we inhabit, structured, seasonal, governed by law and consequence, is not the default condition of the universe. It is an achievement, a hard one, paid for across 10 years of war against the old gods, and again in the blood-soaked fields of the gigantomachy. Zeus is not simply the king of a world that was always orderly. He is the king of a world he had to make orderly, against enormous resistance, with borrowed allies and forged weapons, and the particular courage of someone who had spent his earliest days hidden in a cave, knowing that somewhere above him, a father who had eaten his siblings was still in charge of everything. That origin never left him, and it never should. There is no aspect of Zeus that has generated more stories, more debate, more discomfort, and more genuine mythological richness than this one, his loves. And we should be honest about that discomfort from the very beginning, because the mythology deserves that honesty. Many of the tales we are about to enter involve pursuit, coercion, and transformation. Stories that the ancient Greeks told with a casualness that reflects the enormous moral distance between their world and ours. We are not here to excuse what cannot be excused, nor to sanitize what the original sources did not sanitize. We are here to understand, to look at these stories with clear eyes and ask not only what happened within them, but what they meant, what they reveal about the civilization that told them, the theology they were embedded in, and the complicated figure at their center. With that said, let us begin. Zeus had 7 divine consorts before, and alongside his marriage to Hera, 7. Each relationship produced children of cosmic significance. Each one tells us something different about who Zeus was, what he wanted, and what the Greeks believed about the relationship between divine power and the generation of greatness in the world. His first consort was Metis, whose name means wisdom, or more precisely, cunning intelligence. She was a Titaness, one of the old divine order, and it was she who had helped Zeus administer the emetic to Cronus at the very beginning of the war that remade the world. Her intelligence was formidable, arguably the sharpest in the cosmos. And Zeus loved her, or desired her, or both. The mythology does not always draw a clean line between the two, but another prophecy arrived, as they always did around Zeus. Metis, the prophecy said, was destined to bear children who would surpass their father. The second child, a son, would overthrow the ruler of the gods. Cronus had heard a prophecy like that once. He had swallowed his children in response. Zeus, faced with the same warning, did something both more elegant and more troubling. He swallowed Metis herself while she was pregnant with their first child, and she continued to exist inside him, thinking, working, crafting. When the time came, Zeus experienced a headache of such magnitude that Hephaestus, the divine smith, was called upon to split his skull open with an axe to relieve the pressure. From that opening, fully formed and fully armed, Athena emerged, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and craft, born from her father's head, carrying her mother's intelligence within her by the most literal means imaginable. It is one of the strangest and most striking birth stories in all of mythology, and it is worth pausing on. The goddess of wisdom was born from the swallowing of wisdom itself. Something about that feels intentional, as if the myth is quietly noting that when power absorbs intelligence rather than partnering with it, the result is still intelligence, just born differently, and owing its existence to a violence it did not choose. His second great consort was Themis, goddess of divine law, of righteous order, of the sacred customs that hold civilization together. With her, Zeus fathered the Herae, the goddesses of the seasons, and the Myrae, the three fates themselves. Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Lachesis, who measured it, Atropos, who cut it. But Zeus fathered the fates with a goddess of divine law is not incidental. It is theological. It says something precise, that the order of things, including the inevitability of death, is not random. It is legal, structured, woven into the fabric of the cosmos by beings who answer, ultimately, to the king of the gods and to the principle of righteous order. After Themis came Eurynome, with whom he fathered the Charities, the Graces, those three radiant beings who embodied beauty, joy, and the generosity that makes civilization worth inhabiting. Then Demeter, his own sister, with whom he fathered Persephone, whose story of abduction and return would become one of the most important myths in the entire Greek world, the explanation for why winter comes and why spring always follows. Then Mnemosyne, Memory herself, with whom he lay for 9 consecutive nights, and from those 9 nights came the 9 muses, the divine patrons of every art and discipline the Greeks considered worth practicing. Then Leto, quiet and gentle Leto, with whom he fathered perhaps his 2 most radiant children, Apollo and Artemis. The god of light, music, prophecy, and reason, the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and the wild, twin pillars of the Olympian order, born from a union that Hera pursued with such vindictive fury, refusing to let Leto find any land willing to receive her in childbirth. That Leto wandered the world in labor until the floating island of Delos finally accepted her. The twins were born there, and they were magnificent. And then, finally, Hera, his sister, his queen, his wife, the goddess of marriage, of women, of the sacred bonds of the household. Their marriage was ancient and complicated and stormy in ways that the mythology explores with remarkable depth. Hera was not a passive figure. She was powerful, intelligent, implacable in her anger, and, in the context of their marriage, consistently wronged and consistently aware of it, because Zeus did not stop with his divine consorts. He descended into the mortal world. Again and again, across the full breadth of Greek mythology, Zeus came to mortal women, sometimes openly, more often in disguise. And the disguises he chose are some of the most famous images in all of Western art. He came to Europa as a white bull of such breathtaking gentleness and beauty that she climbed onto his back, and he carried her across the sea to Crete. He came to Leda as a swan, to Danae as a shower of golden light, pouring through the bronze ceiling of the tower in which her father had imprisoned her, to Alcmene as her own husband, returning from war. From these unions came the heroes: Perseus, son of Danae, who slew the Gorgon Medusa and rescued Andromeda from the sea monster; Helen of Troy, daughter of Leda, whose face launched 1,000 ships and whose abduction set the ancient world on fire; and Heracles, perhaps the greatest of them all, son of Alcmene, the man whose 12 labors became the defining image of heroic endurance in Western civilization. This is what the Greeks believed these unions were for. Not merely desire, though desire was certainly present, but generation, the making of greatness. The world needed heroes, beings of extraordinary capability who could do what neither gods nor ordinary men could do alone. Monsters needed slaying, tyrants needed overthrowing, the boundaries of the possible needed expanding, and so Zeus came down and left behind something that was more than human, even if it looked human, even if it had to grow and struggle and bleed like any other person. The hero was, in this reading, the point of contact between divine power and mortal need. A gift from the sky, wearing the shape of a man or woman, given the particular burden of being exceptional in a world that is mostly not. Hera, of course, saw it differently. Every mortal lover was an insult. Every illegitimate child was a walking reminder, and she directed that fury not primarily at Zeus, who was, for obvious reasons, difficult to punish directly, but at the children themselves. Her persecution of Heracles is the most famous example. She sent serpents to his cradle, drove him to madness that led him to commit the act of horror he spent his labors atoning for, and harried him across his entire mythological life with an implacable, grinding hostility that only deepened the tragedy of the hero's story. There is something very human in all of this, not comfortable, but human. A king who cannot govern his own desires. A queen whose pride and pain curdle into cruelty aimed at the wrong targets. Children caught in the weather of their parents' dysfunction. The Greek gods were not meant to be moral exemplars in the way that later religious traditions would conceive of divinity. They were meant to be recognizable, mirrors, held up to the full spectrum of human behavior, but scaled to cosmic proportions so that we could see it more clearly. Zeus's loves are not footnotes to his mythology. They are central to it. They explain where the heroes came from, why the world contains the particular mixture of beauty and suffering that it does, and what it means that even the most powerful being in existence is not free from wanting things he perhaps should not have, and making choices whose consequences outlast the wanting. He was the king of the gods, and he was not always good at it. That tension between his enormous authority and his very personal failings is precisely what kept 3,000 years of storytellers returning to him, unable to look away. Every king must eventually be judged not by his power, but by what he does with it. And Zeus, for all the complexity of his loves and the grandeur of his wars, was understood by the ancient Greeks to be, at his core, a god of justice. Not perfect justice, not the clean, impartial, blindfolded justice of a later moral imagination, but justice in the way that the ancient world actually understood it, as something living, something personal, something that arrived with weight and finality, and occasionally with a fury that made the ground itself remember the lesson. He was called Zeus Diki, Zeus of justice. He was called Zeus Kalaios, Zeus the Punisher, and the mythology is filled, from one end to the other, with examples of what happened when the moral order of the cosmos was violated, and Zeus decided that the violation had gone far enough. Let us begin with the case that sits perhaps closest to the center of all Greek theological thinking about divine justice. The case of Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan, but a titan who had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy, recognizing through his gift of foresight that the Olympians would prevail. He was clever beyond measure, perhaps the cleverest being in the Greek cosmos, apart from Metis herself, and his cleverness was inseparable from his affection for humanity. The early humans, in the Greek mythological timeline, were fragile things, cold, unprotected, living without the tools that make survival possible. And Prometheus, looking down at them with something that can only be described as love, decided to help. He stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. It is worth pausing on the simplicity of that sentence, because its implications are anything but simple. Fire, in the ancient Greek imagination, was not merely warmth or light or the ability to cook food. It was civilization itself. It was the forge, the kiln, the hearth, the lamp. It was the thing that separated human life from animal life, that made art and metallurgy and architecture possible. When Prometheus gave fire to humanity, he gave them the capacity to become something more than they were. He gave them, in a very real sense, the future. And Zeus was furious, not because he did not care about humanity. The mythology is complicated on that point, but because the gift had been taken without permission, because the boundary between divine and mortal had been crossed in a way that Zeus had not sanctioned, because, perhaps, the order of things required that gifts of that magnitude be granted or withheld by the ruler of the cosmos, and not simply seized by a well-meaning titan who had decided that his judgment superseded the king's. The punishment Zeus devised for Prometheus was one of the most haunting images in all of ancient literature. He had him bound, chained with unbreakable bonds to the face of a great mountain at the edge of the world, spread-eagled against the rock, unable to move, unable to escape, unable to die. And each day, an eagle, Zeus's own sacred bird, descended and ate his liver. And each night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver grew back. And the next morning, the eagle returned. This went on, in the mythology, for 30 years, or 3,000. The sources are not entirely consistent, but they agree on the essential shape of it, an eternity of the same wound, reopened before it could fully heal, in a place of absolute isolation at the edge of existence. Aeschylus, one of the great Athenian playwrights, wrote a tragedy around this moment, Prometheus Bound. That is one of the foundational texts of Western literature. In it, Prometheus does not repent. He does not break. He maintains from his chains a kind of magnificent defiance, insisting that Zeus's anger is unjust, that his own action was righteous, and that he knows something about the future, a prophecy he refuses to share, that Zeus needs. The play makes no simple verdict. It holds the tension open, letting the audience sit with a punishment that is simultaneously understandable and appalling, administered by a god who is simultaneously just and cruel. That ambiguity was not an accident. The Greeks were not interested in easy answers. The punishment of Prometheus was accompanied by another consequence, aimed not at the Titan but at humanity itself. Zeus commissioned Hephaestus to create a woman of extraordinary beauty, the first woman, in this particular version of the myth, and had each of the gods give her a gift. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire. Hermes gave her cunning speech and a deceitful nature. Athena dressed her in fine clothing. And then this woman, Pandora, her name meaning something close to all gifted, was sent to the brother of Prometheus, a well-meaning but not particularly wise Titan named Epimetheus, who accepted her despite having been warned by his brother never to accept gifts from Zeus. She came with a jar, or a box, in later translations that have since passed into permanent cultural currency, and within it were contained all the evils that afflict human existence: disease, suffering, envy, greed, despair, the full catalogue of human misery. When it was opened, through curiosity, through carelessness, through the particular human inability to leave things sealed that perhaps should stay sealed, everything inside escaped into the world, everything except one thing, which remained at the bottom when the lid was slammed shut again: hope. The Greeks called it elpis, whether hope remaining sealed in the jar as a mercy, the last good thing preserved before it too could be lost, or whether it is its own form of punishment, keeping humanity reaching for something they can never quite grasp, is a question the myth deliberately refuses to answer. That interpretive space is the point. Zeus's punishment contains within it a philosophical problem that 25 centuries of thinking have not fully resolved. Now, let us speak of other punishments. Because the roster is long, and each entry adds something to our understanding of what Zeus considered unforgivable. Tantalus was a king who had been granted the extraordinary privilege of dining with the gods on Olympus, a mortal permitted into the divine presence, treated as a guest and an equal. He repaid this honor with an act of such monstrous presumption that it became one of the definitive examples of human transgression in the entire mythological tradition. He killed his own son, Pelops, cooked him, and served him to the gods at a feast, either as a test of their omniscience, to see if they could tell what they were eating, or as a grotesque offering, the most valuable thing he possessed. The gods recognized the dish immediately. They were horrified, and Zeus's response was to condemn Tantalus to an eternity in Tartarus that gave the English language one of its most useful words. He stood in a pool of water, beneath branches heavy with fruit. Whenever he bent to drink, the water receded. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches pulled away. Forever hungry, forever thirsty, forever within reach of satisfaction that never, ever arrived. To be tantalized, to want what is perpetually, deliberately withheld. Then there was Ixion, a king who had been similarly honored with a place at the divine table and who repaid Zeus's hospitality by attempting to seduce Hera. Zeus, discovering the attempted violation of Xenia in its most extreme form, first tested Ixion by fashioning a cloud into Hera's shape, and Ixion, finding no restraint within himself even then, proceeded with his intention. He was condemned to be bound to a great spinning wheel of fire turning forever through the sky. And then there is the great flood, perhaps the most sweeping expression of Zeus's judgment in all of Greek mythology. The moment when the god of justice looked at humanity in its entirety and found it wanting. The Greeks had their own flood narrative, centered on a man named Deucalion, son of Prometheus, a man of righteousness, and his wife Pyrrha. Zeus, surveying a humanity that had descended into violence and impiety and the complete abandonment of the moral order, made a decision of terrible scope to wash it away, to start again. The rains came, the waters rose. The world as it had been was erased. Deucalion and Pyrrha survived in a great chest, guided by the foresight of Prometheus. When the waters receded, they were the only humans left, and from them, through the strange, quiet miracle of throwing stones over their shoulders that became people as they landed, humanity was repopulated, beginning again from righteous foundations. What strikes a careful reader about all of these punishments is their proportionality, or rather, their deliberate excess. The punishment of Prometheus is not simply imprisonment. It is endless, renewable agony. The punishment of Tantalus is not simply hunger. It is infinite proximity to satisfaction. These are not punishments designed merely to stop the behavior. They are punishments designed to mean something, to be legible, to communicate to anyone paying attention what it costs to transgress against the divine order. Zeus was not simply angry, he was instructive in his anger. The lesson was always the same, delivered in different registers with different instruments. Across the full breadth of the mythology, there is an order to things. It is real, it is enforced, and the being who enforces it does not forget, does not tire, and does not negotiate once the verdict has been reached. That is a terrifying thing to believe about the universe. It is also, in its own way, a deeply comforting one, because a universe with a Zeus in it, however harsh, however complicated, is a universe where what you do matters, where transgression has a consequence, where the scales, however slowly, however dramatically, eventually balance. The Greeks looked at the lightning and chose to see justice in it, and perhaps that tells us as much about them as it does about the god they imagined wielding it. There is a difference between a god who is worshipped and a god who is lived with. Many deities across the ancient world occupied the first category. They were distant, magnificent, terrible, beings to be approached with offerings and prayers and the appropriate ritual gestures, then retreated from safely. Their power was acknowledged, their presence was felt, but they existed fundamentally at a remove from the texture of daily life. Zeus was different. Zeus was not merely worshipped by the ancient Greeks. He was woven into the fabric of how they thought, how they spoke, how they organized their cities, how they conducted their business, how they understood their place in the cosmos. He was not the god you visited at the temple on feast days and otherwise set aside. He was the god whose name came to your lips when you made a promise, whose presence you assumed when you opened your door to a stranger, whose will you consulted before a battle, a voyage, a marriage, a harvest. He was, in the most literal sense, everywhere that the sky was. And the sky, of course, is everywhere. To understand how deeply Zeus penetrated Greek civilization, it helps to begin not with the grand temples or the Olympic Games. We will arrive there, but with something smaller, something domestic, the hearth fire. Every Greek household maintained a sacred hearth, presided over by Hestia, the goddess of the home. But when a Greek family sat down to a meal, the first offering of food and drink was made not to Hestia but to Zeus, specifically to Zeus Ktesios. Zeus, the protector of the household, the guardian of the storehouse, the deity whose blessing ensured that the family would continue to eat. He was represented in the home by a simple vessel, a jar of some kind filled with tokens of abundance, a reminder that the security of the household was not self-generated. It was granted, and the granting required acknowledgement. This is worth sitting with. In a world without insurance, without reliable medicine, without the complex social safety nets that modern life takes for granted, the anxiety of daily survival was immediate and constant. The harvest could fail, the merchant ship could sink, the breadwinner could fall sick, and the response to that anxiety was not simply practical preparation, though the Greeks were eminently practical people, but devotional. You maintained your relationship with Zeus Ktesios the way you maintained your relationship with a powerful patron, attentively, regularly, with appropriate gifts and appropriate gratitude. He was also Zeus Herkios, Zeus of the enclosure, protector of the courtyard and the boundaries of the home. Every Greek house had its outdoor altar to Zeus Herkios, the physical marker of divine protection extending over the physical space of the family's life. When Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca after 20 years of war and wandering, one of the authenticating details Homer uses, one of the ways Odysseus proves his identity to the old servant who knew him as a child, is his precise knowledge of where the altar of Zeus Herkios stands in the courtyard of his own home. It is the detail of a man who belongs to that place, who grew up within that divine protection. From the household, move outward to the city. Every Greek polis, every city-state, from Athens to Corinth to Sparta to Syracuse, maintained a public cult of Zeus alongside whatever particular patron deity the city claimed as its own. Zeus was not in competition with Athena in Athens or Apollo in Delphi. He was above that competition, in the same way that a national government exists above its individual municipalities. The city had its patron, but the cosmos had its king, and the king's presence was acknowledged at the civic level through temples, through festivals, through the ritual practices embedded in the legal and political life of the community. The most important of these civic expressions involved the oath. In Greek public life, the oath was the foundation of every serious agreement. Treaties between city-states were sworn before Zeus. Legal testimony was given under oath to Zeus. The obligations of citizenship, of military service, of commercial contracts, all of these were bound with his name, because his name was the guarantee. To swear before Zeus and then break that oath was not merely dishonest, it was sacrilegious. It was an offense against the divine order itself, and the mythology provided ample examples of what that cost. This is why Zeus's role as Zeus Horkios, keeper of oaths, was not ceremonial. It was structural. Without it, Greek civic life as it actually functioned could not have been organized. The oaths were the infrastructure of trust, and Zeus was the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure. Now let us speak of the places where Greeks encountered Zeus most directly, where the divine presence was not implied but insisted upon. The first is Dodona. We touched on Dodona in an earlier segment, the ancient oracle in the northwest of Greece, where Zeus's will was read in the rustling of the sacred oak. But it deserves more time, because it was extraordinary in ways that go beyond its age. It was the oldest oracle in the Greek world, older than Delphi, old enough that Homer knew it and referenced it in the Iliad. When Achilles prays before the crucial turning point of that great poem, it is to Zeus of Dodona that he prays. Zeus Dodonaios, the ancient earth-rooted form of the god, the one who speaks through leaves rather than through the visions of a priestess. Suppliants came to Dodona from across the Greek world, from the mainland and the islands and the colonies of the Mediterranean coast. They came with questions written on small lead tablets, some of which have survived, and which are among the most moving artifacts of the ancient world in their ordinariness. They asked whether their wives were faithful, whether their business ventures would succeed, whether the child their wife carried would be a boy or a girl, whether they should move to a new city or stay where they were. The great theological questions sit alongside the intimate personal ones, and the god addressed both with equal seriousness through the medium of his wind-stirred leaves. Then there was Olympia. If Dodona was the intimate, whispering face of Zeus's worship, Olympia was the magnificent one. Located in the western Peloponnese, in a broad flat valley where the rivers Alpheus and Cladeos met, the sanctuary at Olympia was one of the most important sacred sites in the entire Greek world, and at its center stood a temple, and within that temple stood one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, created by the sculptor Phidias in the 5th century BCE, was 12 meters tall, roughly 40 feet, seated on a great throne of cedar wood inlaid with ivory, gold, ebony, and precious stones. Zeus himself was rendered in gold and ivory, chryselephantine, the most lavish sculptural technique the ancient world possessed. He held a figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, in one hand, and a scepter topped with an eagle in the other. His expression, by all ancient accounts, was one of absolute, settled authority. The face of a being in complete possession of everything that exists. The ancient writer Strabo recorded that seeing the statue made viewers feel involuntarily that they were in the presence of something that could not be adequately prepared for. The Roman general Aemilius Paulus, who was no stranger to power and grandeur, reportedly stood before it in silence for a long moment, before saying that Phidias alone, of all artists, had managed to render the god as Homer had described him. And then the games. The Olympic Games began, by ancient reckoning, in 776 BCE, though the sanctuary at Olympia was already ancient by then. They were held every 4 years in honor of Zeus, and they were of such profound religious significance that a sacred truce, the Ikekakeria, was declared across the Greek world for their duration. Wars stopped. Soldiers laid down arms. City-states that had been trying to destroy each other sent their athletes to Olympia in peace to compete under the eyes of the king of the gods. Think about what that meant. In a world of almost constant inter-city conflict, in a civilization that had not managed to achieve political unity and arguably never fully would, the name of Zeus was powerful enough to stop the killing. For a month, every 4 years, the Greek world agreed to be one thing rather than many things. That is not merely religious influence. That is an achievement of social architecture that most political institutions in history have never managed. The victors at Olympia received no money, no land, no material reward of any significance. They received a crown of olive leaves cut from the sacred tree at the sanctuary, and the knowledge that they had been witnessed by Zeus himself, that their excellence had been performed in his presence and found worthy of his regard. When they returned home, their cities celebrated them as if they had returned from war. Poets were commissioned to immortalize them, statues were erected, because excellence witnessed by Zeus was excellence consecrated. Beyond the games and the oracles and the household altars, Zeus shaped the Greek moral imagination in ways that outlasted the specific religious practices entirely. The concept that the universe has a moral structure, that transgression carries consequence, that excellence deserves recognition, that the stranger deserves protection, that oaths are binding. These ideas did not evaporate when belief in the literal Zeus of Olympus faded. They migrated into philosophy, into law, into the ethical foundations of later civilizations that inherited the Greek world without inheriting its specific theology. The Stoics spoke of a divine reason governing the cosmos, the Logos. That was, in many ways, Zeus without the thunderbolt. The Roman Jupiter was Zeus, translated into Latin, carrying most of the same moral freight into a new cultural context. And when Christianity spread through the Greek-speaking Mediterranean, it encountered a world already organized around the idea of a single, supreme divine authority who governed the cosmos through law and whose attention to human behavior was personal and consequential. The specific God changed. The architecture of divine kingship that Zeus had established remained. He was not merely the god of a people. He was, in the deepest sense, the prototype of a way of imagining the relationship between the human and the divine that shaped the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. That is a legacy worth sitting quietly with for a moment. Before we move on, there is a question that every serious mythology must eventually answer, and it is this: if the king is truly all-powerful, why does anything ever go wrong? It is a question that philosophers call the problem of omnipotence, and it is as old as the first moment a human being looked at a world full of suffering and injustice and asked how a benevolent, unlimited divine authority could permit it. The Greeks, characteristically, answered it not with theology but with story, and the story they told was this: Zeus was not, in fact, unlimited, not entirely, not always. He was the most powerful being in the cosmos. That much was settled. But the cosmos itself contained forces, obligations, and constraints that even Zeus could not simply override. And the mythology is full, quietly, persistently full, of the moments when that truth made itself felt, when something pushed back against the king of Olympus, and the king, for all his thunderbolts, had to yield. Understanding those limits is essential to understanding Zeus completely, because a god without limits is a concept. A god with limits is a character, and Zeus, above all things, was a character, one of the richest and most fully realized that human imagination has ever produced. Let us begin with the force that even Zeus explicitly acknowledged he could not command. Fate. The Moirai, the three fates whom we have already met as daughters of Zeus and Themis, were in one mythological tradition, subordinate to Zeus, instruments of his will, the administrative apparatus through which his divine plan was executed. But in another older tradition they were something different, something prior. The threads they spun and measured and cut were not assigned by Zeus. They simply were. They existed before Olympus was established, before the Titanomachy was fought, before the current order of the cosmos was arranged. They were part of the bedrock of existence itself, and Zeus, on certain critical occasions in the mythology, explicitly deferred to them. The most famous of these moments occurs in Homer's Iliad, during the climactic battle between the greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, and the greatest Trojan warrior, Hector. Zeus, who has watched Hector throughout the epic with something close to paternal affection, considers saving him. He picks up his golden scales, the scales of fate, and weighs the destinies of the two men. Hector's side sinks. His death is fated, and Zeus, the cloud gatherer, the wielder of the thunderbolt, the king who can shake Olympus with a nod, sets the scales down and lets the moment proceed. He does not save Hector, not because he lacks the power to intervene, but because doing so would violate something more fundamental than his own preferences. It would break the fabric of what is meant to happen. And even Zeus, it turns out, does not do that. This is a profound moment in the mythology. It reveals that the authority of Zeus is not absolute sovereignty over events, but something more like the stewardship of an order that he did not entirely create and cannot entirely control. He is the king of the gods. He is not the king of fate, and he knows the difference. Now, let us speak of those who did not accept his authority as readily as fate accepted his deference. Hera, his wife and queen, occupies a complicated position in any discussion of challenges to Zeus. She was not a rebel in the simple sense. She was his consort, his equal in divine rank if not in raw power, and her challenges to his authority were domestic and political rather than existential. But they were real, and they were persistent, and occasionally they escalated into something genuinely dangerous. The most dramatic example is an episode in which Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, three of the most powerful Olympians, conspired to bind Zeus while he slept, to actually chain the king of the gods, remove his thunderbolts, and strip him of his authority. The conspiracy nearly succeeded. Zeus was bound, and it was only through the intervention of the sea nymph Thetis, who summoned the Hecatoncheir Briareos to stand guard, that Zeus was freed before the situation became irreversible. The aftermath was swift and memorable. Zeus hung Hera from the sky with golden chains, her wrists bound, anvils attached to her ankles, leaving her suspended in agony as a demonstration of what challenging him directly would cost. The other conspirators were not punished with equal severity, which itself tells you something about the politics of Olympus. Zeus was not blind to the difference between a ringleader and a follower. He was a king, not merely a force of nature. He calculated. But the episode is striking in its implications. The other Olympians looked at Zeus and saw, at least in that moment, not a legitimate authority to be respected, but a concentration of power to be checked. They were wrong in their method. Perhaps they were not entirely wrong in their instinct. Then there was Poseidon. Zeus's brother and co-inheritor of the cosmos was never fully comfortable with his subordinate position. The division of the world had been conducted by lot, the sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades, the sky and therefore the sovereignty to Zeus, and Poseidon accepted this arrangement without ever quite making peace with it. Throughout the mythology, he operates with a semi-independence that no other Olympian quite matches. He pursues his own agendas. He backs his own favorites in the Trojan War, with a stubbornness that brings him repeatedly into tension with Zeus's stated preferences. He builds his own palace beneath the sea, a shimmering, magnificent structure that is explicitly a counterpart to Zeus's palace on Olympus. He does not openly rebel. He is too wise for that, and perhaps too aware of what happened to the Titans who tried. But he pushes, he tests, he makes clear repeatedly that the sea is his, and that within it his authority is primary. Zeus permits this mostly because the alternative, a direct confrontation with his most powerful brother, is a cost he prefers not to pay when the existing arrangement is workable. There is something in that negotiation that feels remarkably true to the way power actually operates in the world. The most purely existential challenge to Zeus's reign, however, came not from the Olympians but from the earth again, from Gaia, the deep and patient mother whose children kept becoming problems for the king of the gods, Typhon. After the Gigantomachy, after the giants had been defeated, Gaia produced one final challenger, the most terrifying being in the entire Greek mythological tradition, a creature so vast and so fundamentally wrong that the gods themselves fled before him. Typhon was not a titan, not a giant, not any category of being that the mythology had previously established. He was something else, something older and rawer. His form, as the ancient sources describe it, defies easy visualization. From the thighs down, he was a mass of coiling serpents. His upper body was beyond human scale, so large that his head, when he stretched to his full height, brushed the stars. He had 100 serpent heads of his own, each capable of producing a different terrifying sound, the roar of a lion, the bark of a dog, a hissing that filled the world. When Typhon rose and marched on Olympus, the gods did not stand their ground. They fled to Egypt, transforming themselves into animals to hide from him. All of them except Zeus, who stayed, and Athena, who stayed alongside him, and who, in some versions, shamed the other gods for their flight. The battle between Zeus and Typhon is the most primal conflict in the Olympian mythology. At one point, Typhon gained the upper hand, seizing Zeus, cutting the sinews from his hands and feet, leaving him temporarily helpless, hidden in a cave. It was only through the cunning of Hermes and Pan, who recovered the sinews and restored them to Zeus in secret, that the king of the gods was able to re-enter the battle. When he did, with his strength restored and his thunderbolts in hand, the resolution was overwhelming. He struck Typhon with bolt after bolt, driving him across the Mediterranean, until the monster finally fell beneath the weight of Mount Etna, which Zeus hurled upon him. Typhon remains there, in the Greek imagination, pinned beneath the mountain, the source of volcanic fire and the eruptions that occasionally reminded the ancient world that the enemy of the gods was not dead but merely buried. The victory over Typhon was Zeus's last great battle. After it, the mythology records no further existential challenge to his reign. The cosmos was secured. The monsters were dealt with. The world settled into the shape the Greeks recognized as their own. But it is worth noting what the Typhon episode reveals even in its resolution. Zeus was wounded. Zeus was captured. Zeus needed help to recover. The greatest fight of his divine life was not a comfortable demonstration of overwhelming power. It was a genuine crisis, survived through a combination of courage, divine recovery, and the loyalty of those around him. That too is part of his character. He won. He always won, ultimately, but not without cost, not without moments of vulnerability that the mythology does not hide or apologize for. And there is one final limit worth naming, because it runs beneath everything else in the tradition, like a deep, quiet current. Zeus could not restore the dead. He could do nearly anything. He could remake the world, defeat ancient monsters, outmaneuver the fates on peripheral matters. But death, once delivered, was beyond his power to undo. When Asclepius, the great healer, son of Apollo, developed the ability to resurrect the dead, Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, because a world in which death could be reversed was a world in which the fundamental order of existence had been dissolved. The boundary between mortal and immortal was the boundary that gave both categories their meaning. Remove it, and everything, the heroism, the sacrifice, the weight of human choice, becomes weightless. Zeus held that boundary firm, even knowing that it meant the people he loved, the heroes he had fathered, the mortals he had protected, would one day cross it and not return. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing about him, the most powerful being in the cosmos, maintaining the rule that takes everyone from him eventually. Even kings must live with what cannot be changed. All things eventually must come to rest. The fires of Olympus cooled. The temples fell quiet. The great statue at Olympia, that 40-foot wonder of gold and ivory, the face of the king of the gods rendered in the most precious materials that human hands could assemble, was eventually carried away to Constantinople in the 5th century of the Common Era, and was destroyed there by fire. The sacred oak at Dodona was cut down. The games were abolished by the Roman Emperor Theodosius in 393 CE, on the grounds that they were a pagan practice incompatible with the Christian empire he was building. The altars went cold. The oracles fell silent. The ancient world that had produced Zeus, sustained Zeus, and genuinely believed in Zeus, passed into history. And yet, here we are, more than 2,000 years after the last sincere prayer rose from the precinct at Olympia, and we are still telling his stories, still using his name, still living, in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, inside the structures of thought and value and imagination that he helped to build. That does not happen by accident. It happens because certain ideas are so well made, so precisely fitted to something deep and permanent in the human condition, that they outlast the specific cultural forms that first gave them shape. The Romans absorbed Zeus almost whole, renaming him Jupiter and carrying him westward across the Mediterranean and northward into Gaul and Britain and Germania. Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best and greatest, was the supreme deity of the Roman state, the divine guarantor of Roman authority, the god whose temple on the Capitoline Hill was the religious center of the most powerful empire the Western world had yet produced. Every Roman military triumph ended there, at Jupiter's feet. Every major treaty was sworn in his name. The pattern established by the Greeks held firm under an entirely different civilization. When that civilization eventually converted to Christianity, the transition was not as clean a break as it might appear. The early Christian theologians who wrote in Greek, and many of the most important of them did, use the word theos, the Greek word for God, and they could not entirely prevent that word from carrying with it the accumulated weight of everything Zeus had meant. The image of God, the Father, seated in majesty, governing the cosmos through law and love, concerned with human justice and human transgression, simultaneously transcendent and personally engaged, did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a Mediterranean world that had spent 1,000 years imagining divine kingship in specifically Olympian terms. The philosophers carried him forward differently. The Stoics, as we have touched upon, transformed Zeus into the rational principle governing the cosmos, present in everything, the logic that holds the universe together. Marcus Aurelius, writing his private meditations in the 2nd century CE, speaks of a divine order to which all things belong and to which the wise person aligns themselves. He does not name Zeus. He does not need to. The architecture is the same. The Renaissance recovered him with passionate enthusiasm, and the centuries of European art that followed are saturated with his presence. Michelangelo's God reaching toward Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling carries something of Zeus in his posture. That settled, patriarchal authority. The creative power extended through a single gesture. Rembrandt painted Danae. Rubens painted the abduction of Europa. Bernini sculpted them in marble. The myths were understood not as primitive superstition, but as inexhaustible reservoirs of human truth, stories about desire and power and consequence that had lost none of their relevance across 2 millennia. And today, right now, in the present world, the Olympic Games were revived in 1896, and they continue, imperfect, commercial, complicated, and still carrying in their bones the ghost of that original sacred truce, that extraordinary moment every 4 years when the world's nations agree, however briefly and however fragilely, to compete rather than to fight. The olive wreath is gone. The thunderbolt imagery remains, scattered across logos and emblems and the aesthetic language of athletic excellence. Excellence itself, the Greek concept of arete, the idea that human beings are capable of something extraordinary and that pursuing it is a form of devotion. That remains the animating principle of the Games, traceable in a direct line back to the valley at Olympia. His name fills our language in ways we no longer notice. The word jovial, meaning cheerful, expansive, generous in spirit, comes from Jove, the Latin name for Zeus, because those born under the planet Jupiter were believed to carry his temperament. The word panic comes from the god Pan, who fought alongside Zeus against Typhon. The days of our week carry the names of Roman deities who were themselves translations of Greek originals. Wednesday is Woden's Day, the Norse equivalent of Hermes. Thursday, Thor's Day, belongs to the Norse thunder god, the functional equivalent of Zeus himself, the sky deity, the wielder of divine force, the king of the celestial order. The names changed, the shape did not. What Zeus ultimately represents, what makes him endure when so many other divine figures have faded, is a particular answer to a particular and permanent human question. The question is simply this: is there an order to things? Is the universe governed by something? Or is it merely happening, random and indifferent, with no principle beneath it? Zeus is the answer that says, yes, there is order. It was fought for, and it is maintained, and it is imperfect, and it is sometimes brutal, and it is administered by a being who is magnificent and flawed in ways that look, from certain angles, remarkably like us. But it is there. The thunder is not random noise. The lightning is not mere electricity. There is a will behind the storm, and that will, at its deepest level, bends toward justice. Whether one believes that literally, or metaphorically, or not at all, the need that belief answers is real. The longing for a cosmos that means something, that holds together, that responds to human action with something other than silence. That longing is as alive today as it was when the first Greek shepherd looked up at the darkening sky above Mount Olympus and chose, in the rumble of approaching thunder, to hear a voice. He named it Zeus, and the name has never entirely left us.